I'm Phil, and today we're making muffins. Cupcakes? No. Cupcakes have frosting. We're borrowing methodologies from a few places to combine them for the best result, so the first thing I'm going to do is preheat the oven to 380 degrees Fahrenheit or 190 Celsius. We need 2 bowls, or if possible, a bowl and a food processor to separately mix together the wet ingredients and the dry ingredients. I'm going to start by putting the dry ingredients straight into the food processor. They are 11.5 ounces or 325 grams of almond flour plus an extra 30 grams or 1 ounce of coconut flour. This is a low-carb recipe, gluten-free. If you're not low-carb or gluten-free, feel free to use cake flour instead of these ingredients in the same amount. To that dry mix, we are going to add 1 teaspoon or 6 grams of baking soda and 2 teaspoons or 12 grams of baking powder. Why both? I'll talk about that in a second, but if you don't have both, then only use baking soda and only use 2 teaspoons total. They are not exactly a 1-to-1 product. I'll talk about what the difference is in a second when we get to the wet mix. Add a pinch of salt, also a teaspoon of xanthan gum. For the wet mix, we're using a ½ cup of sugar. You can use fake sugar if you like. Sugar counts as a wet ingredient because it dissolves. Other things don't dissolve, they just mix in. An egg, a ½ cup or 120 mils of a low flavor vegetable oil. Finally, we're going to use about a cup of yogurt. You can use any kind. I'm using plain. You can use a different flavored kind of yogurt if you want to try to enhance the flavor of the muffin that you're going for. I would urge you though to check and make sure if it is a low fat kind that it doesn't have any extra additives added to it that might affect the texture of your final muffin. So the acid content of the yogurt is what's going to react to the baking soda to make the muffins fluffier and lighter, and then the added baking powder on top of that will provide more lift that lasts a bit longer beyond that simple mixing of an acid and a base. So the same acid that makes milk into yogurt is going to react to the baking soda right when the recipe begins to bake, and then the baking powder will carry it through to be lighter and fluffier in the end. Cup of yogurt, and mix all this together. Now we're going to mix the different parts of this together, and importantly, you do not want to stir it all together very much. Normally you don't want to stir dry into wet very much because you're going to create a lot of gluten, and that is true if you're using flour. We don't want to stir them together a lot because of the acid-base reaction we were just talking about. We want to save as much of that as possible for the baking process. So I'm going to pour this in and stir for about 10 seconds slowly, and that's it. At this point you can add mixings. We're going with about 1.5 cups of blueberries. You can also do the same amount of chocolate chips. You can do a couple of big tablespoons of poppy seeds and lemon juice, diced strawberries, but whatever you do, try your best to get the fruit washed and then dry with paper towels. If you're using frozen fruit, thaw them in advance, pat them very dry. Ideally you want the fruit to not add that much liquid. If you're using an almond flour base, you don't need to necessarily worry as much about the fruit sinking to the bottom of the muffins because the batter is so heavy, but cake flour is much lighter, and you may want to actually dust the fruit with some of the dry mix before mixing it all together, just to help out that fruit with its density. Now's the time to add these in, stir for just a few more seconds. You may still see some streaks of dry mix left in there, and that's normal. Leave them alone. If you do overstir, it'll probably still taste okay. It's just not what we're going for because you may wind up with a much denser muffin that doesn't have that light and fluffy quality. Throw these out into our muffin tins, and we actually probably have enough batter for some extras. If you don't have silicone ones, you can just spray one down, use silicone molds, or if you have parchment paper, you can make your own muffin liners by just crinkling it up and then kind of smashing it down into the shape. Do your best to get them even, but don't overfill them because these are going to rise up like gamers watching a Sonic movie trailer. These are going to go in the oven for about 25 minutes to a half hour. And then one more trick. We're going to turn the oven off and then turn it back on at 400 degrees Fahrenheit or 200 Celsius. So the oven will be warm enough to start the baking process, but this is a trick that will turn the heat of the oven up at the beginning to reach that slightly higher temperature. The exposed tops of the muffins will have that lifting reaction activate and make them fluff up faster before the rest of the bake cooks the outside and firms up the crust. I'm Phil. Thanks for watching SideQuest.